Welcome, everybody, to our second discussion about some of the biggest challenges facing global society. And we have a very distinguished Institute of Current World Affairs panel of alumni here at the House of Sweden. After 2 decades of post-Cold War globalization, the financial crisis of 2008 helped prompt a backlash against open borders, whose full extent, I think is right to say, is becoming fully realized only today. With tariffs and anti-immigration policies dominating the international agenda, how do we advance equitability and human rights in societies in which the chasm between rich and poor is growing ever wider? Our stellar panel includes Joe Batat, at the end, who was head of the World Bank Group's Foreign Investment Advisory Service, and he was a co-dean of the first Western-style MBA program in the People's Republic of China. He is currently a senior lecturer of global economics and management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. As an ICWA fellow, he studied development of science and technology in China from 1975 to 1978. Bacchetti Buogo, next to Joe, is a physician specializing in geriatrics and internal medicine in Britain. He was an ICWA fellow specializing in primary healthcare systems in Cuba, Costa Rica, Kerala State in India, and the Bronx in New York from 1992 to 1995. Bacchetti is also an ICWA trustee currently, and he is a musician and founder of the group Nile Star Friends Forever in his native South Sudan, with plans to open a music school and a mission to advance peace and national reconciliation. Willie Foote, next to Bacchetti, is the founder and CEO of Root Capital, a nonprofit social enterprise that's distributed more than $2 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, Willie, supporting small-scale sustainable agriculture in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. As an ICWA fellow, he studied the impact of free market reforms and rural poverty in Mexico from 1995 to 1997. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Young Presidents Organization, and he serves on the Governing Council of Catalyst 2030 and the Strategic Advisory Council of the Erb Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise at the University of Michigan. And our moderator, Joel Millman. He was a longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal and later became spokesman for the International Organization for Migration in Geneva. As an ICWA fellow based in El Salvador from 1987 to 1989, he investigated arms aid to Central America. He is the author of The Other Americans, How Immigrants Renew Our Country, Our Economy, and Our Values, and he also worked at Forbes magazine as an associate editor.
I want to say at the outset, this is my crew. This is my core ICWA family. It's like the three of us were at the police academy together, and Joe was our precinct captain, and slash rabbi, slash mentor. But I could tell you, we could do nothing but reminisce. But I remember taking Bacchetti to my favorite Senegalese restaurant in Harlem, and him being mistaken for a Senegalese, and all these folks running up to talk to him because you look so familiar. Because he looked, and apparently the Senegalese Wolof come from Sudan and crossed all of Africa, and that bore that out. And that Willie was my neighbor in Mexico City when he was a fellow, and I was post-fellow. So this is a real reunion, and we're just going to ignore you all in chat. But seriously, we discussed how to present this panel, and I very much agree with what the prior panel described their experience and why ICWA's been such a dominant influence in their careers and their perspective on global issues. And I want to start with that and ask each of you to discuss, if you can, the pivot point during your fellowship where something came to you, something you really saw because you've been already there a few months or even years in the listening process that so many of the other fellows spoke about. When you saw something, grasped something, absorbed something that sort of became a lodestar for the rest of your future, really, into your careers. And I will explain, in my case, what that was. I started out my fellowship in Costa Rica and decided to pivot to El Salvador after a few months. And so the moment I recall that I still haven't gotten over all these years later was finding a new home in San Salvador and discovering a country in the midst of a pretty intense civil unrest that was being addressed by a very active U.S. policy in support of the military. And in the midst of all this, there was quite a lot of dollarization of the economy, and the U.S., of course, was almost like a second government, and some would even argue the first government at the time. And I was required to somehow find a place to live and pay for it in cash for the year immediately, because there was a lot of competition for good housing. And so we settled on a price. It was something like $10,000, which was a lot of money. It was way over my budget, but would cover me for the year. And they expected that cash in greenbacks today. That was the way we were going to finance this. And I said, well, I didn't come here, because all my material was all still back in Costa Rica. I didn't come here with that kind of cash, and nobody would. And they said, that's not a problem. Have you got a checkbook? And I said, I did, from my bank in New York. All right, write out a check for $10,000, and I'll be back later today with your money. And I gave it to the landlady to do that. And I said, this can't be serious. This can't not be serious. This can't really be happening. When I give you a check, and you've never met me before, and you're going to give me $10,000 by 5 o'clock this afternoon. She said, of course, we all do this. And so, okay, so that happened. And I paid her. I paid with the cash. And I asked, where's this money all come from? And she shrugged and she said, the narcos, of course. The narco traffickers were coming in daily to mix their money with all the other money that was coming home in envelopes as remittances. That there was a lot of cash in El Salvador. So I wrote this as a newsletter. Some of the fellows who were a generation older than I, who remembered Vietnam, said, oh, this is typical. This is what happens in these kind of moments where the imperial power comes down and so dominates the economy that it transforms it into a satellite of American policy. And on top of that, with El Salvador, which then probably had close to 1 million people living abroad, remittances were coming in envelopes daily to families from El Salvadorans working in the States. And it hit me at that moment that I said, I'm wondering now if this is the first war in history that's being financed by its own refugees. That with this, if these dollars weren't coming home, this government would collapse. The economy wouldn't work without this constant infusion, so big that it attracted Colombian narco traffickers as a place to launder some of their money. And I think I've never really gotten over that, as the understanding that the role that immigrants would play, that migrants would play, that global conflict would play on a small country. And that was kind of my pivot moment. And before I pass it on, I'm going to say that this continues to be things that happen when you get into the custom of listening for cultural nuance in a country that we discussed earlier. I was in Guatemala a couple of years ago for the IOM, actually visiting a coffee cooperative that Willie Foot's group started. So it was kind of a nice full circuit moment. But I was with my translator, a Mayan indigenous woman who was doing some of the interviewing with me. We were talking to families that had family members working in the States, and over drinks in a cafe, a woman that we were talking to got a cell phone call from Memphis, Tennessee. It was her sister, was just checking in at the end of the work week, and she said, I have really exciting news for you. My daughter just came home from school, and she had this painting that we're going to put up on the refrigerator, and the teacher wrote, "Good work, Mary," on the painting. And then the woman said, "Can you imagine? The teacher knows my daughter's name." And in that moment, I knew completely what was going on, that in that town, the teacher couldn't care less what your daughter's name is. The teacher is a political appointee who's there only as long as he's friendly with the mayor. And he's probably just turning on TV set for class and going out and smoking a cigarette with his friends. And the woman hung up the phone, and my translator said to me, "This is why no one comes home anymore. Because once you're up there long enough to have kids, you're never going to bring those kids back and make them be humiliated like this in the way schools are run here. And I don't think I would have seen it without those years as a fellow, learning how to listen and watch and wait for a key moment like that. And that became probably the best training I had for the rest of my career. So I'm asking each of you to reflect on something, a pivot point like that you still have based on your time as a fellow.
Who do you want to start? Okay, great. Thank you, Joel, and thank you to ICWA and Greg and all for organizing this. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm Willie Foote, and as it was mentioned, I was a fellow in Mexico focusing on the financial plumbing and market infrastructure, if you will, of Mexico in the mid to late 90s, when the country was experiencing what you might call a hangover after binging on free market reforms in the first half of the 1990s. And I had worked in Latin American corporate finance and kind of been a banker at the bottom end of the food chain on lots of privatizations and so on. So it was about midway through my ICWA fellowship that I had turned my focus squarely on the rural economy. And so I wrote a newsletter, I remember a newsletter about the Chimalapa jungle in southern Mexico, and kind of consistent with Joel's theme. The Chimalapa jungle, which is one of the last remaining cloud forests in southern Mexico, on the border between Oaxaca and Chiapas states. There were powerful cattle ranchers, many said narco ranchers, who were sending settlers from Chiapas across the border to clear-cut the rainforest, set up small-scale farming, and then within 2 or 3 years, they'd bring in the cattle. And that's something that that's a strategy that has denuded much of the Amazon. It continues to this day. It's really a strategy that's denuded much of the tropical forest regions on the globe. And so meanwhile, there were Zoque indigenous communities that were fighting against this. And the leader of the movement became a friend of mine. And, but Chetty, you know how to do this. I have to sing just the very first line of the song that really led this movement. And it went like this. Chimalapas acabándose de muchos invasores, derrumbando nuestras tierras, de las buenas las mejores. Ay, escuchen con atención, Chimalapas en soque jicará de oro en español. Basically what they're saying is they're destroying the best land and forest that we have, the land invaders. And this is our beloved Chimalapas jungle, which in Spanish means a gourd of gold. And so anyway, that was kind of a powerful newsletter, but what I really wanted to highlight is that I spent a lot of time then in the Chimalapas jungle, and I found myself embedded for a while with an association of vanilla farmers who were toiling away to improve livelihoods for dozens of indigenous families. And so if you picture it, a rushing river below, jungle canopy above, squawking parrots, beautiful, and yet there was a sense of danger because this vanilla farmer cooperative had drug traffickers operating under the cover of the jungle all around them. And getting to kind of the point of the question, that farmer association ultimately failed, not because of their volatile surroundings, but because they couldn't access the capital and the markets that they needed to succeed. And that was the experience or the observation that really guided the rest of my career to this very day, which is I had seen what we now call the missing middle, which is in agricultural finance, too big for microfinance, the $300 loan to the street vendor, the shoe cobbler, too small, too risky, too remote for the banks. So I got back to Boston. I'd never lived in Boston. My wife, Jen, who's over there in the pink, and I were to enroll in the Harvard Business School together. I had my moment of existential clarity on the way back in the truck, and I ditched Harvard Business School. She went, and I launched this organization called Root Capital. And Root Capital is really about filling that missing middle, and our mission is to grow prosperity and resilience of smallholder farming communities globally. And we do that specifically by partnering with and investing in agricultural businesses like a farmer cooperative that are deeply rooted in local community, that are committed to sustainable land management, and that can really become an engine of impact in their communities, raising farmer incomes, creating jobs, sustaining local ecosystems through sustainable agricultural practices. And yeah, we've lent thus far $2 billion to 1,000 businesses in the Global South, provided capacity building to 2,500 businesses. We've impacted about 10 million farmers' lives, incomes, opportunities. And most importantly, we've really helped to create an industry around filling this missing middle in agricultural finance. And it all absolutely ties back to that farmer cooperative of vanilla growers in the Chimalapas jungle, and being able to have the luxury to embed there and really listen and learn.
Yeah, thanks so much. I was going to say, but Chetty, you have participated as a singer with Willie in past meetings, so don't let that hold you back. If you want to sing out your entire pivot point moment, we'll just call you a griot and we'll just go forward.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Bacheti. I'm from South Sudan. I want to thank Greg, and I want to thank Bruce too, and Equa, and all the attendants here for coming. My fellowship started in '92 to '95. I was then a student studying refugee studies program at Oxford University, and an American who was the director of our institute, her name was Cole Barbara Harrelborn, and a friend of Peter Martin, said, Bacheti, hey, there is an advert here from an organization from America to study comparative health delivery systems. I said, well, what's the chance of getting the fellowship? I wasn't very keen on that, but Barbara managed to persuade. And at that time, I had a professor of mine who taught me at the London School of Economics, and he was passionate about developing countries which have done very well in improving the health care of their people. And these were Costa Rica, Kerala State in India, and Cuba. And so I thought about this very well because Sudan by then had applied the WHO approach, the World Health Organization, of a primary healthcare system in the rural areas so that people can improve their health indices. So, I made a proposal to look into these countries and see if I can see what they have done and made the difference, because they are developing countries like Sudan then. What is it that made them so special that their health indices are comparable to the developed world? So luckily enough, I applied and I was selected based on the merits of the pursuit that I was intending to. So in a nutshell, in those countries, the summary of what I got is this. If you want to achieve and develop anything in any developing country, peace is very fundamental. Nothing can grow, and thrive without peace. And there has to be political will, really from the leadership up. And I've seen it in all the three countries that I've mentioned. I had hoped that when South Sudan became independent, that I would go back and maybe be in an advisory role and see how we can manage to improve our lot. Because my experience in Port Sudan when I was working with Ethiopian refugees and going to the health centers and meeting people coming in with diarrheal diseases, communicable diseases, malnutrition, refugees in a foreign land, they don't have employment, they don't have the wherewithal to do anything really. And I thought, well, their problem is not really infection because of bacteria or anything else. It is all because they lack employment, the housing is very bad, it is not planned, they are crowded, for example. And then it's communicable diseases, drinking, bad water, sanitation is poor. So it's a public health issue, not something you can solve in hospitals because you solve some problems, they come back again and they get reinfected. And so I was lucky to go to England to study health planning and financing in 1990. So now that has informed my practice really ever since. So what Equa has taught me all them years, I still keep to me in my approach as I work in England now. It's a different set altogether. It's a developed world and the health problems are different. So, but It informs me with every approach I meet any patient, treat them with the same dignity, and hope that advise them on primary health care, a primary approach and prevention, keeping healthy, health promotion, because this is what people need in a different setting like in the UK and the developed world. So my hope was that I wanted to go back to South Sudan, but then I couldn't because of the instability that still is there. Now, I got to come to play music by coincidence. My brother got married in 2022, and when I went there, I played some 2 songs, and some people were very interested, especially some musicians said, "But Chetty, if you could play like this, why didn't you record?" And so when I got back to England, I recorded some songs, and then got back to South Sudan. We had 2 concerts in 2023 in 1 year. And now we have a small music company which we formed last year, and we were supposed to come here for this event, but hopefully another day. But tonight is going to be a full entertainment, I can assure you about this. Yeah. Bruce, Greg, and the chair and vice chair, Catherine and Fabrice, be ready. We are going to make you honorary South Sudanese tonight. So please, and all the attendants. So it will be at the Krantz Hall, and all will be welcome, really. Yeah, so come and see something different. And so thank you, Equa, for the enlightenment. And once you are an Equan, frankly speaking, you will forever be. And there's no escape from it. The spirit of Peter Martin hangs over everyone. Right.
Thank you, Bichetti. That is a great thing we haven't discussed enough of how many secondary careers has Equa spawned. Yours as a recording star, and that's an international ambassador. It's looking forward to the performance. Joe?
If I can summarize my relationship to Equa is the following. Equa gave me a lifelong amazing ride, full stop. And I decided not to join my 2 colleagues here in their song because every time I sing, it rains. And we don't want to lose this beautiful day. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience as a Equa Fellow and how I got to become an Equa Fellow. I was starting to work on my PhD in international management, international economics, and I needed to choose a part of the world where I could begin to learn about these things. I thought about Brazil, I thought about the EU, etc. But about the same year, Nixon visited China, and I began to be interested in the country. I started to read the very few sources of information about China at that time that existed in 72, 73. But the more I read, the more I became fascinated by it. And the more I said, I have a hunch that we cannot keep 30% of the world population outside the community of nations for too long. Something has to happen. So I decided to take a gamble and try to learn about China. But I hit a brick wall. Chinese embassies and Chinese liaison office would not respond to any of my email. I do understand that, of course, but when you were young, you expect people to respond to your emails. And I struggled and struggled as a student to learn about China and to have access to China. The way I wanted to learn about China is to go to China. I didn't want to do my research through the transcript of radio emission in China, which was essentially the way people used to do research at that time about China, because China was completely closed. My advisor and teacher was observing what I was doing, and one day he said, "Joe, come in." I went into his office, closed the door, and I said, "Oh no, something is happening here." What did I do? So for 2 hours, he asked me about my interest in China. He observed quite a bit of it, but he wanted to ascertain that. And then he told me about a crazy organization called Institute of Current World Affairs. that gives you fantastic support to do what you want. This was nirvana for me. My teacher was a former fellow in Turkey, and he was trustee of the board at that time. And a few days later, I talked to the executive director of the institute, his name is Dick Nolte. And within 2 or 3 months, I was anointed as the next fellow for China. At that time, we didn't do the things that we're doing right now, where you go to your website and find out about the institute, make an application, etc., and go all the way to become the finalist, and then you have a 2-year fellowship. I was anointed because the executive director liked what he heard from me. I don't know why, but he did. And he suggested that I go and talk to a few people who are part of the ICWA family and knew something about China. And of course, at that time, China was totally closed up. South Korea today looks at a completely open nation compared to what China was at that time in terms of the openness. And Dick Nolte and I sat down and tried to see if there is a way for me to get a foot inside the country. And he gave me really carte blanche to find a way of doing it, of course with close consultation with him, since he was paying the bill. What happened is the following, and I was very lucky to meet a gentleman, Canadian Chinese, by the name of Paul Lin, who went to China when the Communist Party took over. He was very nationalistic. He had a very strong national feeling about China. He was not nationalistic. And he went to support the revolution in the new China, ending up in the early 60s as one of the secretary of Zhou Enlai. He was the foreign secretary for Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai told him in 1966, early 1966, get out of China. Of course, because Zhou Enlai knew something like cultural revolution is going to happen. So he went back to China, he went back to Canada, and I met him at Harvard because I was auditing China's law course. He was tickled fancy that I from Lebanon, third world country, he insisted about the word third country, interested in China, and he suggested that I could work with him. So the institute agreed that we moved back to Canada since we were living in Canada before. And I spent 1.5 years learning from Paul Lin about China, reading almost every single book I could put my hand on, essentially giving myself 2 or 3 master degrees, one in Chinese culture, one in Chinese economics, and the other one maybe Chinese history, because I read so much. At the same time, I wanted to be having some relationship with the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, because there was an embassy in Ottawa. And I agreed to work on the China China Pavilion in Man and His Word. I was the director of the China Pavilion, so that allowed me to have very close working relationship with the Ottawa embassy. The institute then supported me to learn the Chinese language, which I did at Stanford, for equivalent of 5 years of Chinese in 1 year. Sometimes when I go back home and I knock at the door, my wife opened the door and I talk to her, and then she said, Joe, I don't speak Chinese. And she was right, she didn't speak Chinese. But it was an intensive, total immersion for 1 year. So what I did also in order to allow me to go to China is I applied for a student exchange program between Canada and China, which was established just a year before. And that allowed me, in fact, to go into China. And that program was for 2 years. But the first year, I went to Beijing University. And as an exchange student, you had at that time, you have a choice of either the Chinese language or Chinese history. And the only textbook that is allowed to learn about Chinese history is Mao Zedong Thoughts. And the third one is what they call political philosophy. And I decided political philosophy because it's essentially really ideology. And I want to understand the ideological base of the Chinese economy and the Chinese decision making. So for 9 months, I was reading Karl Marx, Engels, Stalin, Lenin, and Mao, all in Chinese, and discussing all that in Chinese. After what I got out of it, a second year was really not necessary. It would have been a waste of time for my objectives, and also as a fellow of the institute. So I asked the Chinese government to work in China, and they offered me a number of jobs to teach either language or to edit the propaganda in foreign languages. And I said, no, I want to use my professional experience. One is management, education, and the other one, I used to be a system engineer for IBM, establishing various kind of application, like in particularly hospital management systems. Somehow, one day I was asked by the Chinese government to go and meet a gentleman by the name of Liao Chongzhe. He told me, we are interested in your background. We're thinking of establishing a management education program. Would you like to lead it? I said, it's another nirvana. Yes, of course I want to lead it. So I was hired to establish this management education program, which I did, and I worked in that program for 1.5 years in China, and continued for the next 7, 8 years working from United States and to China. I was commuting between China and the United States. So we established that program. So this was essentially really, and sorry, one more thing. I came back to the United States, and ICWA said, we would like you to continue to what you have been doing, and now start to write your newsletters, because I was told by ICWA that if you go to China, you don't write newsletters. So, because had I started to read newsletters, I would have gone into one of two places, either to prison or on the plane out of China at that time. And that was, I think, a correct judgment, I think. So coming back to the United States, I spent 2 years as an ICWA fellow lecturing for the American University Field Staff, which is an affiliated organization to the Institute, lecturing on China in various universities, writing my dissertation, or trying to write my dissertation at that time, and supporting and continuing to work on the management education program in China. So as you could see, my fellowship in China is a typical one. You just apply, you do 2 years, and you come back home. So that was it was a ride for 7 or 8 years with an amazing support from ICWA. And what really touched me is the trust that they put on me. For somebody whose English was not the first language, not the second language, not the third language. And I never learned the English grammar. So writing in English for me, which is an essential thing for the Institute Fellows, was my weakest point, but at least I was trusted to do what I wanted to do and to bring back knowledge of China back to the United States. Now, you ask about the pivot. The pivot was precisely in that meeting with Mr. Liao Chongzhe. They want us to work together to establish a management education program. This was only a few months after Mao died, only a few months after the Cultural Revolution ended, where management, particularly Western management, was a tool to exploit the proletariat and used by capitalist running dogs and totally attacked by the Communist Party. And when this gentleman says, we want to have a program of management education, I said, what's happening in China? And what's happening in China is Deng Xiaoping did not come back officially yet, but he was in the background, and there was all sorts of rumors that, yes, he came out from the south, where he was protected by the army over there against the Gang of Four, and he may be now somewhere closer to Beijing. And they were starting to talk about reform. I was offered the job in September 1978. The first time there was a public statement about the reform modernization in China was in December 1978, which means 3 months after I was offered the job. So the really pivot point for me was, I know that there was question about reform, and I said, this is real. If it's not real, they would not have offered that job for me. They would not have done it. And it's extremely sensitive thing, to the point where, number one, they refused to call it management. They call it system engineer. But they took me all over China and said, you can use the word management yourself. Why? Because I'm a foreign devil. I could make my mistakes. And that's okay. But at the same time, they wanted me to do that because they wanted to send that message out to the world. Second, I was told after I accepted the job that in fact, the first deputy prime minister by name of Bo Yibo, his Bo Xilai's father, signed the paper for allowing that program to go on and for me to be hired because politically it was so sensitive. And finally, I realized how important Mr. Liao Zhongzhe was, that he was appointed to this program for a small, tiny program of management education, when in a subsequent meeting, when it was decided what I would be doing for that program, and I suggested I need to go outside China, pick up various kind of resources like books, curriculum, buying computers, etc. Mr. Liao Zhongzhe said, exactly right, that's what we need to do. And he addressed one person in the room who I never met before. And as soon as he addressed that person stood up, says, yes, sir, kind of thing in the Chinese. And he said, did you hear what Mr. Batat said we need to do? He said, yes. He said, you do it. His response was, sure, sure, sure. This is the equivalent of, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And that person was the deputy minister of the ministry I was working with. That tells me that the Chinese leadership is putting, by assigning Mr. Liao Zhongzhe, who could say something to a deputy minister the way he did, it means that the Chinese are really serious about that reform. And the rest is history, what China is today.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Joe. We're going to try to get to questions next, but I first want to start asking questions more on the theme of this panel, the globalization, the shrinking world, migration, competition between states, and what closeness, the challenges, let's say, of closeness. And I want to start with Willie. And you may recall in 2000 we went to Chiapas together. And my question to you then remains my question now. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen the restaurant in Los Angeles or the construction site in Florida, competing with the ability to earn locally with what can be achieved by migrating? Puts a lot of pressure on some of the best initiatives in the world today. But similarly, I wanted to talk to you. I want you to address the challenges of ageism in societies that you know very well. The youngest continent on Earth in terms of population is Africa, and the oldest is Europe. One stands right over the other, and its future labor workforce will always be moving northward. There are huge challenges with that. Joe, the China you knew as a closed place is now a China that's ubiquitous, that's everywhere. Talk a little bit about the challenges of that in the years ahead. And I don't know who's ready to speak first. I'm sure Willie's ready to sing, but in any order you'd like to respond, and then we'll open it to questions.
I'll start and make it brief. So it's a great question. It's a very tall order to compete if you're working in agriculture, in a farmer business, when you see online every day what's going on with your brothers, sisters, cousins in LA, whatever. I guess what I would say is, first and foremost, we have to remember that there are, in the case of smallholder farmers, 500 million in the world, so that's 2.5 billion people. It's 1/3 of the world's population. We simply cannot absorb that kind of crashing wave of humanity on our already overcrowded mega cities in the global south, and we can't absorb them into the global industrialized north. So being able to come up with exciting ways where agriculture or agricultural entrepreneurship is a destination career for young people. I guess it's not skinny jeans set anymore. It's more like balloon jeans. Digital natives, young people where there's an entrepreneurial platform, digital strategies, AI, and maybe in particular, and this is something that in our organization and kind of our sector, we talk a lot about how do we have a vision kind of prosperity where farmers are climate vanguards as opposed to being climate victims, where they are the solutions providers. For instance, nature-based solutions, where one of the great sweet spots of nature-based solutions and so-called regenerative agriculture is agroforestry. A lot of ICWA fellows have looked very closely at agroforestry, which is basically farming with trees to create an environment that mimics a natural forest. And those nature-based solutions, without keeping those trees on in the tropical forest regions, on the mountainside, we are never going to hit net zero. And so being able to sell mangoes, avocado, coffee, cocoa, shea butter, on and on, fruiting tree crops and agroforestry systems, where it's a commercial crop, you got a margin that can actually provide enough profitability to pay farmers well, to invest in infrastructure, to participate in the digital revolution, to become AI. We work with an organization called Digital Green, which is an AI-driven farmer chatbot. All of these types of things, and the offtake, the buyer is, say, Starbucks or Whole Foods or Chinese buyers now. We spend a lot of time at trade shows in Asia these days because that's where a lot of the demand's coming from. So I guess in short, we have to embrace the fact that of those 500 million smallholder farmer families, many of them shouldn't be working in agriculture. They're going to step out of agriculture into medium-sized cities, service jobs, or they're going to be climate refugees and immigrate. Some of them are going to hang in the next few generations through subsistence agriculture, but many of them can step up into transformational agricultural practices that really are farmer businesses. Farmers should be at the very heart of any nature-based solution. And nature-based solution is important in terms of beyond decarbonizing the energy sector, which is where most of the world's focus has been in terms of climate finance and so on. Reforestation, restoration, stewardship of those existing forests where people can actually make money and have a living wage. That's going to be really critical for us, but it's not easy, and it's going to be kind of it's part of the solution. It's not the only part. A lot of what you've been working on is another piece of the solution.
What is different now? What is the future of an ubiquitous China look like? I was in Guinea last year, about a year ago today. I met a guy taking the ferry from Conakry to Freetown, a Chinese gentleman was taking his family on a weekend vacation in Sierra Leone. And then he mentioned to me that he's one of 1,500 Chinese farmers in Guinea, that his kids all go to a Chinese school. And I just had a really hard time getting my brain around that. I mean, Guinea is pretty challenged, but a population of 1,500 small farmers really speaks to me about how deep the Chinese footprint is around the world, and particularly in the developing world. So this is very different from what you experienced. What do you see as future challenges to the world integrating China in such a big way?
We have to live together. The African has to live with the Chinese. The American have to live with the Chinese. The Chinese have to live with the Latin Americans. We are here on Earth's ship, and we have to live here. And I think what has happened in some ways is that we're going through cycles in terms of our relationship with China, and also in terms of what China is doing in the world, in the following ways. When China started to improve its situation and becoming close to becoming the second economic power in the world, we tended to look at China and saying, is it a competitor and a partner, or is it an enemy, or is it anything in between? And we go through cycles in terms of emphasis on one aspect of the range or versus other aspect of the range. Unfortunately, during COVID and immediately after COVID, some jingoistic kind of views of China came up more and more because the Chinese gave us the COVID. Do you remember the China flu that some people called it? And also the Chinese pushed very hard in some sectors to be the number one in the world, like for example, the batteries and things like that, which all of us know about it. And there was a little bit of that I sense here in the US in the last 4 or 5 years, where seeing China more as a threat rather than as a potential partner and competitor. And one of the good things about what has happened in the last 6 months with about the tariffs vis-a-vis the Chinese goods going up to 147%, which basically says you're not going to sell anything to us. What has happened is they pushed, I think the US pushed the Chinese to react to what's happening in a way that no other countries reacted by standing up, being very quiet and very calm, and with no hubris and no exclamation points in your X messages at 2 o'clock in the morning. The Chinese thought about how we're going to react to those decisions on the part of the tariffs, and what do we do about it? And they reacted in a very, how shall I say it, pointed way and in a way that really hit the weaknesses of the American situation here, the American position. And what I see as a good thing about it is, I think since both sides were hurt and both sides realized that the other party is going to stand up to its position, what we saw in Busan in South Korea about last month is both parties took a step back and realized that we have to do things a little bit more positively, a little bit more constructively, and not start to beat up on one another. In a sense, you remember the MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. We have a version of it, a mutual assured pain. Instead of calling it MAP, we call it MAP. And I think both sides realize that we cannot beat up on the other without us being hurt ourselves also. You raise another aspect of the Chinese is they're being all over the world, and they are all over the world, partly because of positive and pro kind of factors, like the Chinese wants to be involved and have access to resources, access to market, whether Africa, Latin America, etc. But partly also because of the void that the US has been showing and acting around the world. USAID is one example. I don't need to tell you much about that. So when there is a void, people move in that void. And that's what the Chinese are doing, really. And the fact that you do have 1,500 Chinese in whatever, Guinea or other places, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not really surprised at all. So we need to learn how to live with that. They need to learn how to live with us. And again, there's no mass as an option for the moment.
Point out that when I was with the IOM, we had a statistic. There are 200,000 Nigerians just in Guangdong province. So it kind of balances out, you know, the 1,500 in Guinea. Pachete and
It's about migration. Why are people leaving where they belong to and going to other places? I think I'll give a real true example of what's happening in Sudan now, in South Sudan. Why would a person leave their own country and go elsewhere? In the olden days, when I was very young then, Sudanese only went out to do some training. And after they finished their year of training, they returned back home. That was it. You don't stay overseas for any reason. South Sudan, for example, excuse me, we come from a land where we are blessed with riches. The definition that we are poor, I don't accept it because we are not. Really, if you looked at South Sudan, for example, it has got the rivers, the land, a population which is, 12 million in a place which is many times the size of France, for example. So for us, it is something else that is causing young people to go. In London recently, I was coming out of a shop and I saw some 6 South Sudanese young men. Their ages range between 18 and 25. How did they get to England? They risked their lives to cross the Mediterranean Sea in this kind of inflatable boats. But why are they fleeing? Is it the glamour of Europe and development or all of that? No, that is not so. Because some has even they cross these dangers without the consent of their parents. But what is driving them outside of their countries is because of the insecurity and lack of jobs. For example, if you are a graduate, your parents have, worked very hard. And remember, they are not like wealthy people, but they have managed to put their children through education, secondary and university. But when you finish your university studies and you have your degree, it's just a piece of paper which is not worth the ink on it. You will be staying unemployed for years and years. And if you get a job, you will find yourself that you're not getting a salary for a year or so. So people become, they go to other things, alcoholism, and even drugs now are available, for example, in Juba, for example, you see. So you find the meaning of life is not worth living, you see. Some take their own lives, some, risk it, okay. If it is not good in the country here, I'll go overseas. And that's why you see many of them in Europe and coming here to America. It's not because their countries are lacking things that they could benefit from. But what is underlying all this? It is the political will of the leadership. They have been let down by their own governments. This is the truth. People who exposed, for example, high values that we want our independence, for example. In my case, South Sudan, the entire international community had the goodwill to support us in what we were doing. For over 50 years, South Sudanese have been fighting for independence, and they got it. They got it with a lot of resources from overseas and friends of goodwill that could help. But what did we do? You begin to wonder why people have lost the vision and what they had planned for their country, you see. So you find that it is self-inflicted pain and destruction and, developing corners of powers that control things. So I think migration is really caused by some factors which are within those countries themselves. And it is not just the want of coming overseas. Because when I was born by the riverside, some time long ago, I never thought of leaving the South Sudan. I remember when my father died in '86 in a plane accident due to that war. A civilian plane was shot down. 63 people died on board, you see. In his paperwork from the ministry when his retirement was being, his papers file was being checked, he said, my father never left the Sudan. My grandfather left the Sudan. I have not left the Sudan, you see. So really, I think my point is that people have to understand, and I can not talk about the other 53 countries in Africa. It's a large continent with many countries. But I think if you see many people coming this way, crossing rivers and doing all risking things, they are running away from situations which not anyone would like, for example. I mean, to be fair, why don't we look at the migration from Europe to find lands everywhere in the olden days? Discoveries. Why? You see, people go elsewhere to find something new, resources, and so forth. So what I would say that it is forced migration by their own situation from their own countries. And I do hope really that when they come here, they be looked upon with some compassion really, because they're running away from things that are not so good. Yeah, some are taking their own lives, suicide, be it by, hanging themselves, overdose, yeah, things like this. They are happening in Juba right now. So I hope people will do more to effect change in ways that will make life better for people in other developing countries. Thank you.
That was very helpful. I just came back from Omaha, which is the largest South Sudanese colony outside of Africa. 10 to 12,000 people have settled, and they're doing quite well. So I get a feeling for what that much of what you're saying and what's driving this change. We're going to do questions, and if I don't get a hand up soon, I'm going to start calling because I know people's names here, and so you in the back with the red, yep.
Hi, my name is Sarah Holman. The impact on migration is what I'm curious about, and China's role in stepping into that void now, because China knows that there will be a need for assistance, and that they can use that for their own political purposes. But they do come with a different ideology, a different ethos than USA did. How do you see that impacting, I guess, migration and then economies maybe in these areas? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure who to respond first to this, but I will say that late in my career at the IOM, I was sent to an emergency situation when a cyclone hit Mozambique, and I was impressed from the moment I landed by the Chinese presence as an aid deliverer. They intended to be the biggest actor in that event of all the international community that was there, setting up tent cities and bringing supplies in. And you contrast that with the new administration's response to the Myanmar earthquake, and then of course the hurricanes just recently in Jamaica. It's astonishing how quickly a nimble, dedicated economy can respond, and how poorly a recalcitrant, reticent American administration responded. There's a huge challenge there in extending soft power and helping the image of the country, but I'm not sure how to link that to future migration. So, would any of my fellow panelists like to engage?
I'll just share the following. So my organization, Root Capital, we had a bit of a body blow, just as one example, with the dismantling of USAID, where we lost about $8 million in funding and have done a reduction in force from 200 people to 140 people. And having said that, so I was at Climate Week during UN General Assembly Week. The strong feeling there was like, all right, well, let's just get on with it. U.S. is stepping aside for the time being. Europe's not, China's not, the rest of the world's not. As we all probably are aware, COP30, the Conference of the Parties, is happening as we speak in Belém, Brazil. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for China, for everyone to pile into what has been way too little focus on investment opportunities, private sector opportunities. Doesn't have to be just extractives, can be things like what I was talking about. Climate finance right now, and just to be very clear, a symptom of climate change and the impact, the acute and accelerated impact of climate change in the global south is migration. The solution, one of the biggest solutions, is to recognize that annual global climate finance, which is financial products, financial strategies specifically designated to climate solutions, is $1.3 trillion right now. We have 2.5 billion people, as I said, who depend on agriculture as their primary source of income. Way less than 2% of the 1.3 trillion in climate finance annually goes to farmers in the global south. And that's a moral failure. It's also just a massive missed opportunity to direct resources into those communities. And I think right now, it is a huge heartache that USAID was dismantled, there was a lot of brokenness in the system, you know, the traditional aid system and the USAID contractors and so on. So we just we gotta build it better. We gotta lean into those who are actually stepping up right now, but like focus on where it matters most. We have to invest in climate resilience and bring a lot in it. It makes sense that we were decarbonizing the energy sector, gotta continue to do that, but you gotta have way more money going into nature-based solutions and keeping forest standings and investing in carbon capture through natural solutions, not just through decarbonization of the energy sector.
We have someone over here. Please identify yourself, and also if you want to ask one of us in particular to respond, please say so.
Okay, my name is Ann Dix. I'm also former USAID. My question for you is, well, I could talk hours about climate change, and I love what you just said, but it's really about workforce development and migration and workforce. And in your multiple experiences, how you see workforce and, you know, the population decline in the developed world as an opportunity to further interlink our economies in different ways.
I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for many years, and so labor markets and integrating supply chains is something I covered a lot. When I got to Geneva to work with the United Nations, I discovered that this was a crucial future. Everything you can think of, you have Polish butchers going to the UK under the UAE, you know, before Brexit. It was a crisis for the Poles. Where was the next butcher and plumber and electrician going to come from? And so we had programs to train people in Uzbekistan and Georgia to learn enough Polish to go up to Warsaw. And of course, then they would all go on to Germany anyway, and that created a new problem. But in the Far East, higher income countries were beginning to worry about replicating Japan's immigration and demographic issues. They were afraid of a future where people are living into their 90s and 100s, and there aren't enough caregivers in the country. So we got engaged, particularly in Thailand, training Cambodian women to come into Thailand. These were jobs waiting for them that Cambodians were risking their lives to cross irregularly or illegally into the jungle, car accidents and different things, sometimes abused by smugglers, just so they could go work in a nursing home in Bangkok. So countries wanted to get out ahead of that, and I think that shows a lot of promise. There should be more of it, but you have a lot of racial and ethnic and tribal resistance all over the world to bringing in a new workforce, which is ironic because those same countries will employ them all day illegally because it's cheaper, but they don't want to give them the dignity of a legal position. But I think when they start coming to organizations like the UN and asking for help, that's a good sign. That means they're thinking about how to make this a regular part of their integration. So thanks for your question.
I would like to bring in a totally different perspective about what your question for a migration and supply chain domestically. In the case of China, as you probably know, in the last 20, 30 years, there have been a massive migration from the countryside to the cities. And that fueled, in fact, the Chinese economic growth. Without those workers coming out of agriculture, I don't think China would have been able to be the way it is right now. So you had a migration going from the countryside particularly to the east part of China. Now there is something else going on, is that since cost of living and wages are much higher on the East Coast, the Chinese government thought it would be better not to continue with this kind of migration, but to have the supply chains moving into the hinterland and have a division of labor between the two. I think that aspect has not been looked at much, has not been studied much, but it's fascinating.
That's uplifting. All right, who's got a question? I see Kimberly Conroy is smiling. She's from the Wharton School and very close to any comments, questions, please, for the audience, for the panel.
I'll add to the reflections to the former USAID friend here, just to say in the case of Africa, Africa has a huge, depends on the way you want to see it, glass half full, glass half empty. Glass half full is it has three massive advantages in this century, which has more potential for renewable energy than anywhere else in the world. Think solar, of course, think things like enhanced rock weathering and massive basalt rock deposits, which can contribute to huge carbon removals and so on. So there's that. It also has by far and away the most fallow land in any part of the rest of the world, hence agriculture, transformative agriculture, entrepreneurial agriculture, regenerative agriculture. You strengthen biodiversity, you steward resources, you improve farmer livelihoods, etc. And then thirdly, it has the youth bulge. It has an enormous next-gen pool of talent. So if we can figure out through all sorts of different strategies, USAID funded lots of these, accelerators, apprenticeships programs, ways to provide job opportunities and career prototypes that can be destination, very exciting, sexy destination careers for young people, but based on the strategic advantages of Africa itself is really critical for the next century. So you can see those things, and maybe right now they're manifested, as you well articulated, Bachete, in crisis and heartache and migration and so on. But at the same time, you know, the African continent is going to go from 1.2 billion people to 2.3 billion people, billion increase by 2050. So we have to be investing in this and kind of pay it forward and invest in where those strategic advantages lie. Not just focus on extractives and oil and gas and so on. And maybe lastly, you don't have all this legacy infrastructure. As with cell phones and kind of communications, telecommunications, you can kind of leap forward and invest right now in the renewable energy and new types of jobs in the kind of agriculture that is going to work with nature, as opposed to what we've done everywhere in the industrialized north, which is entirely and completely against nature. And I will just share, and it goes back to the USAID situation. Guess what percent of farm income in the United States comes from government transfers? Just to think about subsidy that's required. 80% in farmer income in the United States comes through government transfers. Right, so think about, like, none of that's happening in Africa, but if you go to Africa right now, you go to Indonesia, where we work in Southeast Asia, you go to parts of Latin America, incredible innovation right now. Incredible, like, leapfrog technologies and next-gen talent, entrepreneurs, lead farmers who are crushing it on AI, but there are going to be uses that are not necessarily going to come top-down from, like, the World Bank. They're going to come from grassroots up at the community level, which is why we say, tech bros or gals say, last mile distribution for your product. No, first mile farmer networks. That's where the solutions start, and that's where we have to invest.
Okay, I'm getting a signal that Kimberly wants to retract her statement that this is an awesome panel and add something different, and it's also our last question.
So my name is Kim Conroy. Thanks. I was a fellow in Mexico a long time ago looking at migration, and I now work at something called the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a joint master's degree at MBA and a master's in international policy and intensive language training all at the same time. I'm their career advisor. I help them get jobs. So I'm into job creation. But truthfully, I wanted to ask Joe, because I must say one of the things I find most distressing about the current administration is sort of the way we're rolling back anything and everything that has to do with climate change, and which is of course a hoax, and solar and wind and everything. And I feel like the Chinese have done a much better job getting up to speed fast, but I also feel like we have to figure out how to cooperate to get their technologies and get better at our technologies and work together to solve this existential problem. So how are we going to get there?
It's very painful to see what the US policy has been in terms of climate change and technology for batteries, for example, etc. Non-renewable energies, for example. As you probably know, more than 15, 20 years ago, the Chinese banked on that, and they used it as a strategic factor for economic growth and for social growth. We did not see it that way from the very beginning. What I feel a little bit sad is that now that we realized the importance, number one, more realized the importance of it. Number two, we realized that we are falling behind the Chinese. Now what we're trying to do is to stop transfer of technology, for example, from China to the United States. You probably know that Ford Motor Company was going to open a battery factory using Chinese technology by licensing it, and it was stopped. My understanding, it was stopped now by the administration for the moment. Whether it will continue or not, I do not know, but my understanding, it has been stopped. So in some ways, there's definitely a regret that we did not follow, or at least went with the, not other Chinese necessarily, but went with a policy that mirrors the Chinese in recognizing the strategic importance of all those technologies. And what we're doing is we're reacting against it and try to close the door. Hopefully, we will have a change of views and we begin to realize the importance of what's happening. I don't think we missed the boat. I don't think so yet. But we don't want to miss the boat.
Thank you all very much. Fascinating discussion, expertly moderated. Not surprised. Thank you all for joining. We will reconvene. We'll take a half an hour break, and we will reconvene at 1:15 for our next panel, Culture Across Borders.